Committee will come to order. Thank you all for being here. To start, I'd ask unanimous consent that the chair be authorized to declare a recess during today's hearing, if needed, without objection. So ordered. Well, good afternoon, and welcome to this afternoon's hearing to take stock of the conditions of the Coast Guard's shoreside infrastructure and the risks facing ports and maritime operators in this new era of climate uncertainty. When hurricanes Irma and Maria struck the Caribbean and southeast United States in 2017, it was, of course, the Coast Guard who worked tirelessly and relentlessly to conduct search and rescue, reopen ports, remove debris, bring life-saving relief to hurricane-stricken areas. At the same time, however, it's worth remembering that the Coast Guard's own shoreside infrastructure, which is vulnerable and located directly along the coastline, suffered over $800 million in damages. Offices lost roofs, communications went dark, and piers suffered extreme damage from flying debris. In Puerto Rico, while service members worked to save lives across the island, their own families were forced to relocate from shoreside facilities rendered inoperable and inhospitable. To date, many of the service members working in Sector San Juan still work out of trailers, while their base remains under repair. This circumstance was not solely an issue of extreme storms and freak events. Rather, these events provide a painful snapshot of the very tenuous operating conditions Coast Guard service members worked through, caused by the service's long-standing mismanagement of the maintenance and repair of its shoreside infrastructure and housing. Few people realize it, but the Coast Guard owns or leases more than 20,000 shore facilities. Far and away more real estate than all other properties under the control of the agencies within the Department of Homeland Security. Yet the service's outdated, uncoordinated, and under-resourced infrastructure management policies and practices have resulted in a $2.6 billion backlog in deferred maintenance, repairs, and reconstruction. The service members have been reported to conduct repair work while off-duty is not only a slight to those members, but a condemnation of the Coast Guard's collective leadership in this area that would allow such mismanagement to persist at the expense of a workforce already strained and stretched thin. And that's simply unacceptable. Furthermore, the deterioration of the Coast Guard's shoreside infrastructure will only be exacerbated by climate change. We spend billions on new assets, cutters and aircraft that are critical indeed to execute the Coast Guard's 11 statutory missions, while at the same time, the basics, piers, boathouses, barracks, airstrips slowly crumble away. That's not semper paratus. You know, the Commandant of the Coast Guard, Admiral Carl Schultz, has stated that it is his objective to ensure that the Coast Guard is ready, relevant, and responsive. And we need to add resilient to that list of the 3 R's. As sea levels rise, extreme storms become more powerful, and coastal land subside or erode away. The Coast Guard needs a rigorous new strategy to identify, design, budget, and build its shore infrastructure. It's up to this committee, of course, and this Congress to provide the Coast Guard with the resources necessary to address its infrastructure backlog, and even more importantly, to build infrastructure that will be more durable and less costly to maintain over its lifetime. If we're apportioning blame, we should look in the mirror as well. We must additionally take stock of our commercial ports and maritime terminal investments in the coastal zones. Each year, more than 1.2 billion metric tons of foreign commerce comes through American ports. If the United States wants to remain globally competitive and avoid future dislocation of the maritime supply chain at vital ports, such as the Port of New York and New Jersey, right down the river from my district, we need a rigorous assessment of our critical port infrastructure and its vulnerability to coastal hazards, especially sea level rise. To date, no such assessment exists, and I'll be interested to hear our second panel's thoughts on this idea. Whether you believe climate change is a hoax, and I certainly hope you do not, the reality is that government agencies, local communities, maritime stakeholders, and others are dealing with the physical, observable impacts caused by climate change, and those impacts are happening right in front of us. They're happening now. So let's talk about how we can adapt to and mitigate these impacts. This hearing brings together an exemplary panel of experts from coastal engineering, adaptation planning, and risk management to illustrate how agencies like the Coast Guard might better adapt to increasing coastal hazards. In closing, today's extreme flood is tomorrow's daily high tide. To successfully navigate a changing climate will demand strategic design, planning, and investment across the public and private sectors. And we need to do that in time to do us some good. As a government and economy deeply invested and dependent upon a global maritime supply chain, how we respond to this challenge today will have a direct bearing on whether we maintain our standard of living or not. This hearing will help us intelligently assess the vulnerability of the maritime transportation system and build back better as we move into an era of unprecedented risk. Now I'd like to call on the ranking member for any remarks.
Thank you, Chairman Maloney. As we all know, since 2000, the Coast Guard was faced with its cutters and aircraft operating more than 50 miles offshore becoming obsolete. Understandably, the Coast Guard has chosen to focus extremely limited capital acquisition funds to the purchase of those assets. And there is good news on that front. The Coast Guard just announced the home port for its 42nd Fast Response Cutter, and the Coast Guard has awarded a contract for construction of the 10th and the 11th National Security Cutter. The Coast Guard has also acquired new medium-range patrol aircraft and is recapitalizing its long-range patrol aircraft. Unfortunately, the single largest recapitalization contract for the offshore patrol cutter is not executable, and we await the Coast Guard's solution to that problem. However, while the Coast Guard has made those important and significant investments, it has developed a large and growing shoreside construction and maintenance backlog, and its IT systems have aged to the point that the Coast Guard operations are constrained. Investments in those areas are becoming crucial if we expect the service to continue to carry out its missions. The Coast Guard estimates its construction and deferred maintenance backlog of $2.6 billion. But this is one-for-one replacement of assets and does not reflect a strategy for carrying out Coast Guard missions in an efficient manner. Given the specific needs of the Coast Guard for coastal facilities, the service is particularly vulnerable to the impacts of coastal storms. Yet GAO has found that the Coast Guard does not follow the Department of Homeland Security's risk management framework. In addition, the GAO found that the Coast Guard has not identified all the shoreside assets that are vulnerable to potential storm damage, such as piers and runways. I am also interested in whether the Coast Guard has followed through on its modernization effort. It has established the Shoreside Infrastructure Logistics Center, but it seems to continue to operate a highly decentralized infrastructure repair and maintenance operation out of its 6 civil engineering units. I look forward to hearing from Rear Admiral Moore how the Coast Guard is centralizing its review and prioritization shoreside infrastructure. I am also interested to know more about how the Coast Guard is preparing facilities for its new cutters and aircraft. The new assets are larger and more sophisticated than the old assets and require improved shoreside support. I'm hopeful that the planning process for those assets and their support infrastructure is being well coordinated. Fortunately, my district does not suffer direct impacts by coastal storms, but I sympathize for my coastal colleagues. I know Subcommittee Member Congressman Graves of Louisiana has had major flood events in his district, and Congressman Weber has floods going on right now in Jefferson County, Texas. In addition, to Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands were visited by Hurricane Karen yesterday. Therefore, I look forward to hearing the suggestions of witnesses on Panel 2 for the construction of more resilient port facilities to better withstand such coastal storms and flooding. Mr. Chairman, thank you for holding the hearing today, and I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. I'd now like to recognize Chairman DeFazio for any remarks.
I thank the chairman. I wish that I could stay. I unfortunately have to be at a briefing on the 737 MAX very shortly. So I just want to first recognize a member of the second panel, Dr. David Cox, and I know how hard it is to get here from Oregon. I appreciate him traveling. Professor at the College of Engineering and has tremendous experience in dealing with coastal engineering resilience. And hopefully, his testimony will give us some direction. The Coast Guard has been mentioned. There's a $2.6 billion backlog. I think the Coast Guard has for many years done an excellent job with not enough resources. I've been to many stations where the coasties themselves are doing the work, and we're maintaining some very unique older boats in the Northwest, and the facilities are beautiful. But we need to better partner with the Coast Guard and better invest. And the Coast Guard is the only uniformed service that has not done extensive studies on the impacts of climate change, sea level rise, and more violent weather events. And it's critical as we were before, hopefully we invest some of this $2.6 billion in areas that will be more at risk. We will take into account what we should do to better protect these facilities in the not too distant future, or heck, given what's been going on this year, next year. So I hope to hear from the Coast Guard on that. We did put a provision in the Coast Guard authorization, which has passed out of the House quite some time ago. And the Senate, as usual, is dithering around. But we did put a provision in there to require that the Coast Guard do such an assessment, and I think it'll be experts like Dr. Cox who can help you work your way through this. So we don't want to have to rebuild it twice, and that goes to all of our infrastructure, surface infrastructure. 47,000 bridges need repair, substantial repair replacement. 40% of the national highway system deteriorated to the point where you have to rebuild it. And transit, and we have to make those investments in a way that anticipates, the continued detrimental effects of climate change, and Coast Guard should do likewise. So I'm fully supportive of any initiatives Coast Guard takes in this area. I'm supportive of getting them more resources to deal with these problems. And again, I wish I could stay, and I can't. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, I thank the gentleman. I should also point out, I'll also be required on the House floor at some point during the course of today's hearing, so I may also have to depart for a period of time, depending on the floor schedule. So I apologize in advance if I miss some of the testimony today. But I'd like to thank our first two witnesses, Rear Admiral Nathan Moore, Assistant Commandant for Engineering and Logistics, and Mr. Nathan Anderson, Director of Homeland Security and Justice for the Government Accountability Office. Gentlemen, we thank you both for being here. Without objection, your full statements will be included in the record. And since your written testimony has been made part of the record, the subcommittee requests that you limit your oral testimony to 5 minutes. With that, Admiral Moore, you may proceed.
Chairman Maloney, Ranking Member Gibbs, members of the subcommittee, good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to speak about Coast Guard infrastructure today. And thank you for entering my oral testimony into the record, as you've stated. As the Assistant Commandant for Engineering Logistics, I'm honored to lead the 5,000 men and women of the Coast Guard dedicated to maintaining our diversified portfolio of operational assets and shore-based infrastructure. As I speak to you today, our engineering logistics workforce is providing critical support to Coast Guard operations around the clock and across the globe. Every Coast Guard mission begins and ends at a shore facility. Not only is our shore infrastructure relevant to operations, it's essential to our readiness. The Coast Guard's all about readiness. Admiral Schultz has outlined in the Coast Guard strategic plan that a resilient shore infrastructure is directly connected to operational readiness and successful mission execution. While my engineers take pride in our efforts to support operations, we face challenges related to the maintenance and recapitalization of our infrastructure. As the largest shore asset portfolio in the Department of Homeland Security, much of the Coast Guard's infrastructure is aging faster than we can maintain or replace it. With the growing depot-level maintenance and recapitalization backlogs totaling more than $2.7 billion. Our installations are geographically dispersed and range from large operational or industrial facilities in urban areas to small tactical units in remote areas. As many of our facilities are located on or very near the coast, they experience the daily corrosive effects of salt water and wind and are vulnerable to flooding and increasingly severe weather. The devastation that we have seen from recent hurricanes underscores that risk. Despite these challenges, we have observed the benefits of modern, resilient infrastructure at locations where we have made investments. Thanks to support from both the administration and Congress, we have constructed new facilities to resilient standards with high return on investment. We're working expeditiously to execute nearly $1.2 billion in supplemental procurement, construction, and improvement appropriations for the 2017 and 2018 hurricanes. We make our infrastructure more resilient by modernizing design specifications and construction technologies at every opportunity. We aim to maximize our limited resources to invest in resilient infrastructure that directly enhances the Coast Guard's operational readiness. For example, our new infrastructure at Sector Houston-Galveston has proved critical to Hurricane Harvey response operations, during which the Coast Guard rescued 11,000 people. We've recapitalized the 100-year-old facilities in Massachusetts and recently finished facilities for new aircraft and cutters in Alaska, California, Hawaii, North Carolina, and New Jersey, with others under construction in Guam and Texas. Despite this progress, the Coast Guard has made and continues to make difficult decisions within a constrained budget environment to balance the recapitalization of our operational assets with investments in our shore infrastructure. We thank the Congress for the opportunity to further communicate our infrastructure needs through the annual unfunded priorities list. Our fiscal year 2020 UPL includes over $570 million to address our most critical shore infrastructure priorities. At the same time, we continue to align our property with our mission needs. Since receiving direct sale authority in 2010, we have divested more than 205 real property assets and deposited more than $26 million in proceeds into the Coast Guard Housing Fund, which supports the recapitalization of housing for our service members and their families. While we highlight our progress, we recognize that we can do even better. With the benefit of insightful reviews from the Government Accountability Office, we are already improving our shore infrastructure management practices and incorporating them into our strategic planning. Moving forward, we will employ a holistic approach that includes establishing performance goals and measures to track the effectiveness of our investments, aligning our shore infrastructure portfolio with mission needs to include pursuing divestitures, establishing more detailed guidance for planning boards, and employing modeling to optimize our investments. In closing, as one of the nation's 5 armed forces, the Coast Guard's ability to remain semper paratus, always ready, to answer the nation's call fundamentally depends on reliable and resilient shore infrastructure. With the support of Congress and the administration, and informed by GAO's recommendations, we will continue to overcome our infrastructure challenges and successfully execute our missions in service to the nation. I appreciate the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Anderson.
Chairman Maloney, Ranking Member Gibbs, and members of the subcommittee, good afternoon. My testimony today discusses our findings and recommendations from 3 recent reports on Coast Guard's management of its shore infrastructure. I will discuss the condition of the Coast Guard's shore infrastructure, actions it has taken to improve its management of shore infrastructure, and key actions the Coast Guard needs to take to better manage these assets, which may help it save money and reduce risks. Regarding the condition of the Coast Guard's shore infrastructure, the Coast Guard's inventory is vast, aging, and vulnerable to damage from extreme weather. The Coast Guard has more than 20,000 shore facilities with a replacement value of over $18 billion, and nearly half are beyond their service lives. Coast Guard data show that it will cost at least $2.6 billion to address current deferred maintenance and recapitalization backlogs. Now, at recent funding levels and with existing business practices, it will take the Coast Guard nearly 400 years to address the projects currently on their backlogs. This brings me to my next point. The Coast Guard has taken some steps to manage its aging infrastructure. Specifically, the Coast Guard classifies its infrastructure under a tier system that differentiates mission-critical assets from mission support assets. Additionally, Coast Guard guidance prioritizes investments in infrastructure for frontline operations, such as piers or runways, over assets like administrative buildings. The Coast Guard has also initiated an assessment of vulnerabilities that its shore infrastructure faces. From 2015 to 2018, the Coast Guard analyzed occupied buildings for vulnerabilities to natural disasters such as hurricanes and earthquakes. However, significant work remains if the Coast Guard is going to make headway on reducing its backlog and to ensure wise use of limited resources. And this brings me to my final point about key actions the Coast Guard needs to take. First, the Coast Guard should employ models to optimize infrastructure investments. Earlier this year, we found the Coast Guard used a model to optimize its investment in aviation pavement for the repair of assets such as runways. This model showed that changing when and where such repairs take place could save nearly $14 million. Despite having this model, the agency has not yet implemented the model's results. The Coast Guard should use the results of this model, and it should employ such models to its entire portfolio of shore infrastructure, which may enable it to achieve cost savings across its 12 other asset lines. Second, the Coast Guard should standardize facility assessments. In February 2019, we found that different units responsible for assessing the condition of infrastructure did not always follow consistent processes, and inconsistent processes raise questions as to whether the Coast Guard has the information it needs to set risk-based priorities for shore infrastructure and subsequent project selection decisions. Third, the Coast Guard needs to fully implement DHS's risk management framework to improve shore infrastructure resilience. In a report we issued today, we found that the Coast Guard has not fully aligned its processes for improving shore infrastructure resilience with DHS's 5 key steps for critical infrastructure risk management. Since 2005, Congress has appropriated more than $2 billion in supplemental funding to rebuild and repair Coast Guard infrastructure after severe storms. Data show it is often far cheaper to enhance the resilience of infrastructure before extreme weather strikes rather than to fix it after it is damaged. Nevertheless, while the Coast Guard selects projects to fund every year from its backlogs, officials were unable to verify that they consistently select projects with resilience in mind. That is, projects that will protect infrastructure before it is damaged and cost pennies on the dollar compared to rebuilding after extreme weather. Aligning its processes with DHS steps would provide greater assurance that the Coast Guard is investing resources to minimize potential damage and expenses caused by future extreme weather events. In closing, while the Coast Guard faces significant expenses and time to repair, recapitalize, and make more resilient its shore infrastructure, it can augment its business practices in such a way that more efficiently allocates its resources and better positions the agency to respond to risks from extreme weather. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Gibbs, members of the subcommittee, this concludes my statement. I'd be happy to take any questions you may have.
Thank the gentleman. We'll now proceed to members' questions under the 5-minute rule. Begin by alternating between the majority and the minority. Begin by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. Admiral Moore, there were some eye-popping parts of Mr. Anderson's testimony. Would you like to respond to any of that? I mean, I can ask you about each one, or I could just let you go.
Well, I think I could say, sir, just as an opening statement, that we're certainly appreciative of GAO's recommendations. I think for me, as the Chief Engineer of the Coast Guard, as we work through our plan and how we get after this issue and we see the readiness that's impacted in the field, we really appreciate the outside look that an organization like GAO gives us. They've created in this report 6 specific recommendations, and we concur with all 6 of those. In fact, we've already taken action on a couple of them. Most recently, some of this standardized facilities condition assessments. I actually control that out of my office and signed that out about a month ago, and we're doing that now Coast Guard wide. So I think you know, as an overall statement, I would certainly say we appreciate the outside look, and we're taking action to address those recommendations.
Anything in the report you disagree with?
Not as a functional you know, set of comments. I mean, no, sir. I mean,
So we can expect progress on all those recommendations?
yes, sir. I've got my folks working towards each one of those 6 recommendations, and we have detailed timelines on how to get there.
Let me try to understand the scope of the problem. So I'm told that you know, 46% of the shore infrastructure is beyond its service life. That the project backlog will cost at least $2.6 billion, but as I understand it, the majority of projects don't have cost estimates, and of the projects that do, they represent less than half of the total number of projects. The average cost for the ones that do have cost estimates is about $17 million, and if you're doing the math, you get to a notional number that would be far in excess of the $2.6 billion total cost. So how do we, in the absence of cost estimates for the majority of the projects, have any idea what the true size of the backlog is, or can you shed some light on that?
Yeah, thank you, sir. We do have cost estimates and different fidelity. What I would say about that backlog is everything on the backlog is not equal. There are certainly projects on that list that are more critical to our operations and to our support of our personnel in terms of housing, et cetera. So we focus our effort and the limited funding that we do have for shore infrastructure on those projects that are executable. So while the backlog itself is large, we certainly focus our efforts on things that we believe are executable and projects that we're going to actually undertake to increase our readiness.
Admiral, could you also say a word about the risk management framework that DHS has, and could you expand on that? Is that the same process you're talking about implementing, or are you talking about something else?
Sir, that risk management framework is something a little bit different. Underneath the Department of Homeland Security's guidelines, we have submitted our first component plan for resilience. My office just signed that out a couple months ago. That's our first effort into a plan for resiliency, and included in that are several specific steps that we're taking. One is a complete shore infrastructure vulnerability analysis that we've undertaken for all of our facilities. We've started with a phase 1 report, which we have completed already. which analyzes all of our facilities against natural threats such as hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, tsunamis, wildfires, that kind of thing. Phase 2 will be to look at our buildings based on seismic and wind vulnerabilities. And then Phase 3 is what are we going to do about it, right? Phase 3 is the actual plan for how we tackle that. So that's all underneath the component plan for resilience that DHS, we submitted to DHS.
Can I ask you for a little preview of coming attractions on that? I've only got about a minute, but do you have any visibility into that Phase 1 assessment? I mean, common sense would tell you they're all in the water, aren't they? I mean, are all of them vulnerable to sea rise? I mean, how sweeping is that finding going to be?
I think at some level, all of our infrastructure is vulnerable. I mean, it is all on or near the water and accessible to that air, salt air in particular, and water. Different levels of vulnerability, though. I mean, the initial assessments that I've seen will show us that there are some locations where you're at an elevated, you're in an elevated location. Some locations are built or are newer than others, so built to modern.
Was it fair to say that common sense or an early glimpse at the survey would suggest that you're going to have a sweeping set of concerns, that the scope of this issue could be massive? Is that fair to say?
I mean, it's going to be significant backlog of work in addition to what we already know, but I think we already know most of it, sir. I mean, I think that's where, you know, we've been doing this for years, and we know that these assets that we place on the water are vulnerable to these natural threats. So it'll be a significant report, but I don't think there'll be that much new information that we didn't already know.
All right, thank the gentleman. Yield to Ms. Gibbs.
Thanks, Admiral. Thanks, Mr. Anderson, for being here. Admiral, in your testimony, you talked about how the shore facilities are directly connected to all operations, which is obvious, I think. And then Mr. Anderson testified about 400 years to fix the backlog, which is staggering. So obviously, a lot of planning and prioritization is going to have to occur with funding, of course. Is the shoreside infrastructure planning initiative separate from the planning, design, and acquisition process for the new assets?
Sir, there is some overlap there. We use our same people, our same set of resources to attack both those problems. We have what's called a major acquisition systems infrastructure budgetary line item, MASI, we call that. The MASI account is specifically programmed to us for the arrival of new assets, so new ships, aircraft, C4IT, basically to prepare the shore infrastructure for arrival of those new assets. So what we do is we fold together that MASI funding for new assets with our current depot shore infrastructure money that we use for existing assets, because there's obvious overlap there as we roll assets into our operating bases today.
Yeah, it's important to have that coordination. You know what you're saying. Okay. The GAO found that the piers and airstrips are not necessarily included in the $2.6 billion maintenance and repair backlog. What actions need to be taken to review those assets so we have more complete Coast Guard's capital assets backlog?
So we do include piers and runways and all of those facilities, including housing, into that backlog. So again, everything on the backlog is not equal. There are some things that are deemed more essential. We look at anything supporting that operational readiness. We look at our housing program, any of those things that directly affect our members as most important. Again, we have a very detailed prioritization process that we use on 6-month intervals to analyze all of those projects and prioritize which ones are going to be funded.
Okay. What's to be the long-term impacts of operation of the Coast Guard for personnel of carrying such a large backlog?
Yeah, sir, thank you for asking that question. We know there are impacts to our people on this. I mean, we talk a lot about boats and aircraft and cutters that get underway, but in particular on the housing side, there are significant impacts to our people as we face backlogs there. Our people do tremendous things, and we've seen the recent response to Hurricane Dorian and the Coast Guard being on scene there quickly. And from my perspective, we realized that all of that response a couple weeks ago to the Bahamas all that response came from shore facilities and assets where we're struggling on the shore infrastructure side. So the impacts to our people are real, both operationally and from the housing front.
Recently, Ranking Member Sam Graves toured the Barbers Point in Hawaii, the hangar there, which is has an unfunded mandate list for $100.5 million project. It would, project that would include housing, the C-130Js and the MH-65s. What's the likelihood this funding will be included in the administration's fiscal year 2020 budget request? You guys recommending for that to be in there?
Sir, we continue to make tough choices as we look at our funding constraints on what, where we place new assets and what gets put into the budget for acquisition. I can tell you from the shore infrastructure side, a new hangar facility is needed in Hawaii, and that's why you see that on the unfunded priorities list. We greatly appreciate the ability to provide that list to you and to demonstrate our highest priority needs, and that Air Station Barbers hangar point is certainly one of them.
Okay, appreciate that. When we talk about modernization, we saw with Hurricane Katrina and the restructuring called modernization. What does the Coast Guard intend to implement a national process for reviewing and rating individual projects? Have we, I guess that's where I get into prioritization. How are we doing that, and reviewing each individual project? And
We have a very detailed process. I mentioned these every 6-month reviews. We centrally review projects and for prioritization, and then we regionally review them as well. And that way we get a field operator's perspective and also a centralized view for the larger recapitalization projects. That process is very time-tested and well-worn for us. It gives us a good opportunity to provide those highest prioritized projects.
I just got one last question. We're out of time. Of the 10 recommendations, the last 3 GAO shoreside infrastructure reports, how many have been fully implemented, partially implemented, or received no action?
Sir, I'd have to refer to the record to give you a detailed breakdown from all 10 of those reports, but we have taken action on a significant number of GAO's recommendations, and including this most recent report. As I mentioned, we're in agreement with all 6 of those recommendations.
All right. Thank you. You go back.
Gentlemen, Mr. Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, gentlemen. Admiral Moore, can you kind of give us a little bit of color in terms of with this, deferred maintenance and the repair backlog, about the impact on the mission? Give us some examples. How is it impacting the mission? How is it impacting your members' families? I mean, just kind of tell us a story or two. Sometimes we get lost in these numbers, or at least I do, and I like to. I haven't yet been out to visit a Coast Guard facility. It's on my list. I'm new to this committee, but tell us about the impact.
Yes, sir.
Let's say time period in which it would take in terms of the backlog and the maintenance. What years?
400.
400 years. Can you tell me a little bit about the assumptions you make, and is that a flat, sort of a steady level of investment? Is that a declining investment in maintenance and repairs? What are some of the assumptions that you made to reach that?
Unfortunately, the news doesn't get better. That is a 400-year estimate based on projects that are on the backlog right now, and does not consider any projects that will come on in future years, and that's clearly going to happen. That's just a reality. So the assumptions that we used were what is being spent right now on the backlogs, what is being requested from Congress, and what is being appropriated for the purposes of trying to buy that down.
And just so I understand the sort of like the magnitude of this $2.6 billion in backlog, could either of you tell us what is the current year's appropriation and spend for maintenance and repair of infrastructure?
Sir, I'm happy to take that one. For FY19, we had $195 million enacted in our enacted budget for us. We're looking at about the same level of the President's budget for FY20, about $200 million. That's in our depot level shore maintenance funding. We also have a significant chunk of money for the new acquisitions that come online. So most of that is also shore infrastructure. But it's in terms of depot maintenance, it's around $200 million a year, sir.
Got it. I think this is probably my final question. Admiral, you mentioned that the Coast Guard has divested itself of how many properties you mentioned?
It's just over 200 in the past year.
And that's real property. And okay, can you just tell a little bit about your process, the criteria you use to divest of certain properties, and does that list of criteria include your ability to maintain it?
Yes, sir. We do look at, really constantly looking at our shore infrastructure portfolio for opportunities to divest. As we bring new assets online, there's a constant balance of what the shore footprint needs to look like, to support those assets and operate them. Housing is also a significant portion of that. We have over 3,000 housing units, both owned and leased, around the world. So we do go through a rigorous process of determining where we can divest certain properties, and we follow the standard federal procedure for doing that, including providing a real property report to the Congress every year of our progress.
Thank you. I'll yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Weber.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Admiral, you said there's 5,000 coasties? Was that what I understood you to say?
In my organization, sure. for
In your
engineers and
organization.
Maintainers, yes, sir.
Oh, okay. Can you break those out by state? Do you know how many are in each state? I mean, not here, but
I can take that for the record, sir.
you can get that for me. And one of the questions I had is, in the Shoreside Infrastructure Planning Initiative, is it separate from the planning, design, and acquisition of new assets?
They are linked. To answer your question, yes, they are separate, but they are linked through that Massey account. So the idea that as we bring new infrastructure on, we know that we're going to be, we want to make sure that new infrastructure that comes with new assets is a complement to what we already have.
As more and more disasters happen, and Ranking Member Gibbs alluded to, we're the first 3 coastal counties of Texas from Louisiana, that other foreign country. We're coming down the Gulf Coast, and both Hurricane Harvey inundated us, and then Imelda inundated us just a week ago. And the Coast Guard's been great, being Johnny on the spot and just doing everything needed. But as more and more disasters happen, is it pushing that planning process back for acquisition of new assets?
No, sir, it really isn't. In my world, in the maintenance world, and in rebuilding the shore infrastructure, we've been very fortunate and very appreciative of the hurricane supplementals that we received from Congress. That supplemental funding has provided us the ability to repair projects from those damage that we received in the storms. Our shore infrastructure that happens around the country elsewhere is largely those are separate projects, obviously, that go on around that. I would say specifically for in your district, sir, and in other coastal areas, we've made great strides in resiliency of those facilities. And I think about Sector Galveston and Sabine Pass there that were destroyed by Hurricane Ike back in 2008.
I've been to both.
Yes, sir. And then you likely know that the day after Hurricane Harvey came through, we were operating out of those facilities.
Absolutely.
What that shows me is if we make a wise investment and recapitalize at new resilience standards, we won't have to come back and do this again.
So 400 years that he's talking about, we won't have to worry about this.
Yes, sir. That's exactly
Yeah, I got you. You said there's 200 properties that y'all have divested of. How many properties would you say are on our ledger sheet?
I think we've got around 10,000, properties of different size. Some are very small, some are large, but it's around 10,000.
Okay, and you said you had divested some of the properties around the world? You had housing units, I think 3,000 housing units in the world?
Yes, sir, including, places like Guam and obviously the, outer continental locations in Alaska and everywhere, so.
Are we divesting ourselves of those?
The ones that are no longer needed, we are constantly looking at where we need more housing, where we no longer need housing based on changes in our footprint, changes in the local economy's ability to support our members, et cetera.
Are you doing those and divesting of those properties obviously in the various 50 states?
We are. It isn't restricted by any particular geography. We look at it holistically.
And is there a list of those who may be on the quote-unquote chopping block?
Yes, sir. That real property report that we provide every year details the assets that we're in the process of divesting.
Okay. Does it take into account the length of waterways that move a lot of commerce, like Mississippi or the Sabine Neches waterway? Does it take that into account?
Yes, sir. Before we make any decision to pursue divestiture, all those factors are included.
And so you do an analysis on the amount of freight or trade or the military personnel. As you may know, Port of Beaumont in my district moves more military personnel equipment than any other port in the other lesser 49 states. And so y'all take that into account as you're looking at those divestitures. And you have a list of those that you might be considering that's every year?
Yes, sir. I mean, that real property report tells us exactly where we're at, which ones have been divested, and how we are moving forward.
I'd like to get that list if I could, Admiral, if you could get that to my office. And I'm basically out of time. I'm going to yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Ms. Plaskett.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, gentlemen. I've always have to bring up that the Coast Guard have been exemplary in the Virgin Islands, and we could not do many of the things that we do to protect ourselves without their support, and so I'm grateful for that. Acting Director Anderson, the Coast Guard received over $700 million in supplemental appropriations to restore facilities damaged by Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, Maria, and then Matthew. How has disaster funding been applied by the Coast Guard to rebuild island facilities to date?
Portions of that question I may have to get back to you on. We do
Okay.
have some in-depth analysis about, where the funding went, which stations were hardened as a result of some of that. But what I can say is the Coast Guard does deserve credit in this space for using the supplemental appropriations to rebuild and repair to higher building standards. There have been several instances where doing so has actually, saved money down the road when extreme weather has struck those same areas again. Sector Houston, Galveston was
So
able
it's
to.
discussing in Texas.
Exactly. It was a role model effort there where it was hard, the infrastructure was hardened. When extreme weather struck, they were able to use that as a central command post and do a lot of their emergency operations out of that.
Okay. Do you see mechanisms in place for creating strategies to do improvement in this?
Our central point of our report that was issued today is really that the Coast Guard has an opportunity to be a little bit more forward-looking in this space. And what I mean by that is getting supplemental appropriations after the fact and hardening that infrastructure after the fact is good, but there's some statistics out there by the National Institute of Building Sciences that says for every dollar invested in resilience, you save $3 to $12 down the road. So doing it on the front end helps. And what we haven't seen is that integration of vulnerable facilities, vulnerable infrastructure, kind of integrating that into the project selection when trying to buy down the backlog. So that's an opportunity the Coast Guard has.
Okay, so not just using those that are damaged, but recognizing those that need hardening so that they'll be able to withstand.
Exactly, and that comes from having a firm and comprehensive understanding of where the vulnerabilities are. Our report that we issued today found that the Coast Guard has information on 16% of its infrastructure.
What can we do to support them in being able to do that?
Well, I think it's important to note that when making resource allocation decisions, not having 100% certainty of what vulnerabilities exist, more information is needed. And my understanding of the short infrastructure vulnerability assessment, which is the main process that the Coast Guard follows, it won't be complete until 2025. So from now until 2025, you're operating with 16% visibility as to what the vulnerabilities are.
Admiral Moore, did you want to add anything to that?
I thought first I could mention in terms of the work at on the islands there and the idea of this the hurricane reconstitution funding. We have provided detailed expenditure plans to Congress for both those supplementals for 2018 and 19, and those detail and specifically by project what we're working on there throughout the whole effort. So that information is available and to be provided so you understand exactly what work is being done. As far as the resiliency, I completely agree. I think we are first of all, we are making an effort to make sure that anything we build to monitor resiliency standards withstands future storms and we don't have to come back and spend that money twice. We do very much appreciate the recommendation to include that resiliency analysis into our construction decisions, and we're going to take that forward for action.
Thank you. I look at Sector San Juan, which is responsible for all of the Coast Guard throughout my district, and they suffered an estimated $156 million in infrastructure damages due to Maria. 2 years ago. And I'm just thinking about the particular vulnerabilities that those of your sectors that are in what would may be considered far-flung areas may face in that with respect to that. And then, you know, how do you need support from us? I'm concerned about supplementals and those which kind of segregate the territories, which then put you in a more vulnerable state in terms of doing your infrastructure builds. But is there any other thing you'd like to add?
Yeah, thank you, ma'am, for the opportunity. There is one particular area that would be very helpful for us within the housing portfolio. We've talked about housing a little bit here today, but we have a backlog that's significant there. It's included in that larger backlog. And many of our homes where we need maintenance, we don't have the funding within our budgetary constraints to get there either. If we do have a housing fund that, as we divest properties, we've been able to put money into that fund. We've got about $26 million in there currently. However, we can't access that fund without an appropriation. So if we could have the authority to access our housing fund without a direct appropriation, that would give me the funding and really the flexibility to be able to attack our most critical housing issues.
Thank you. Rear Admiral Moore, the GAO found that the documented $2.6 billion Coast Guard shoreside maintenance backlog does not necessarily include piers and docks, and I understand that the Coast Guard Great Lakes icebreaker home ports are in desperate need of major repairs, and I'm told that the Coast Guard pier at Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, which is a major logistics location, particularly during ice season, we have a lot of ice on the Great Lakes in winter. If some of you who live in warmer climates haven't been there, you're always welcome to come from Texas. But those logistics locations are crumbling. They're unable to accommodate fuel trucks, and the Coast Guard Pier in Detroit has a failing electrical shore tie to provide electrical power to cutters moored there. We just visited, my whole team went to the Coast Guard facility in Sturgeon Bay in my district, and they're in a building that's a century old. They're doing great work, by the way, but and they didn't complain about it, but that is a concern for me. I guess, is there a cost estimate for doing the work at Sault Ste. Marie or for Detroit that you know of?
Yes, sir. Thank you for the question. There are cost estimates for those two projects, both Sault Ste. Marie and Detroit. I am aware of those two. That is part of our shore depot maintenance fund. So you won't see a specific line item for that because those are repairs to existing facilities, not hurricane damage, but just repairs that need to be done. So we do have cost estimates. Those are competing through our process for funding, and I am aware of exactly what you're talking about.
So that, I guess, just to clarify my understanding, forgive my ignorance, were any funds requested for Sault Ste. Marie in the FY 2019 Coast Guard budget requests? Would they be subsumed within that broader pot you mentioned?
They are within that pot of AFC 43 depot level maintenance, and we have prioritized those projects for funding in the future. The other thing I could point out is on our unfunded priorities list, the UPL also has a item for this depot maintenance facility money. So projects like what needs to be done at the Sioux and in Detroit, those would both fall under that account. So there's actually opportunity there on the UPL as well.
Okay, so we'll see them on the unfunded priority list, both Detroit and Sault Ste. Marie?
What you'll see is the line item that says AFC 43 depot level maintenance. That includes all of our repair work at our own facility. So it's a broader pot of money that we can use for those facilities. But what I'm telling you is those two projects are prioritized within that pot.
Well, and then what I would ask, and obviously it's something you can take back, if there are cost estimates, if we can work with you to sort of see those cost estimates and a timeline for dock repairs, I think we all want the same thing here, and so I'd just love to work with the Coast Guard on that issue if you can take that back.
Yes,
Let the record show he's nodding.
Yes, I'm happy to do that.
And I know it's outside your responsibility, but let everyone know at the Coast Guard know we're keenly interested in another icebreaker on the Great Lakes. Hearing from my constituents in Northeast Wisconsin that there was not enough ice breaking on the Great Lakes this past winter. Some ships weren't even able to head out on the first day that the locks opened because they were afraid of ice damage. And I think it's imperative we get another icebreaker of the Mackinac size on the Great Lakes. So take that for what it's worth. And for my colleagues from warm climates, the cold builds character. So I'd be happy to host you in my district.
Mr. Lowenthal. Whoa.
Oh, I don't want to deal with climate changes with just adding to tourism. Admiral Moore, thank you for being here. I apologize for coming a little late. I was in another hearing. I want to ask you about the critical issue of how the Coast Guard manages its assets and how you mitigate some of the risks that are posed by sea level rise and other aspects of climate change. What are the models? I'm primarily interested in the standards or what do you use, or the anticipated levels of sea level rise or flood risk and vulnerability does the Coast Guard use when designing new facilities? What do you see as the standard? Or when you're trying to assess critical infrastructure risks? Can you give us more about what level of, how you predict the future, or what you're using as your measure, as your model?
Yes, sir, I'd be happy to do that. Any of the new shore infrastructure that we're building, any of the hurricane reconstitution, hurricane supplemental work that we're doing to reconstitute those facilities, that's all done to modern resiliency standards. So we employ modern building codes. We do things like relocate facilities upland, so you're not, you may have a lot of older facilities that are low-lying, even stilted in some areas. We're able to move those inland a little bit and upland. And so what we end up doing is building 2 feet above the FEMA 100-year floodplain. That's a requirement now.
For 2 feet above?
2 feet above the 100-year floodplain level that FEMA has set. So again, the idea is as we spend this money, the precious money that we get for shore infrastructure, we don't want to have to spend it twice.
Do you anticipate in your thing the level of sea level rise? What you see in terms of specifically, in terms of how that will impact your infrastructure? And what sea level rise you anticipate in the next 20 to 30 years?
So for me, on the engineering side, civil engineering side, we're working to the modern standards. I mean, I don't, we basically follow the guidelines for what modern construction standards and resiliency metrics would mean. That's probably the best answer I can give you.
All right. I want to also talk about, this subcommittee has supported the Coast Guard's important mission in the Arctic. We think we've sought to increase resources dedicated to this region as we open it up to commercial and to recreational kinds of activities. And so you must maintain a presence, it's required, in the Arctic to execute your statutory mission. But so far as I understand, you've done little to maintain the Arctic shore infrastructure that you have. Can you speak to the Arctic shore infrastructure needs and what the Coast Guard is using to address climate impacts like thawing permafrost on the existing and future sites?
Yes, and in the Arctic, we have what we do every year is a typical exercise called Arctic Shield. That's seasonally based primarily around the summer, but it's a scalable, expeditionary style of operations. So that gives us the opportunity to adjust to weather conditions or population moves or ship traffic or that sort of thing. That idea of having sort of a scalable, mobile, expeditionary style response helps us in the Arctic. To answer your question about shore infrastructure, we are putting significant investment into Kodiak, sir. That's where we know we're going to be home porting major ships. That will be our hub for Coast Guard housing in the future, and we have a housing listed on our unfunded priorities list in Kodiak. We have shore facilities that we're using that acquisition infrastructure funding to be ready for those new ships in Kodiak. That's where our focus is today.
Thank you. And finally, I want to express my concern about DHS's July Section 503 notification that it's going to reprogram, I think it's $24.4 million from the Coast Guard to fund additional ICE detention beds and transportation resources. Members on this committee have fought to make important progress to grant the Coast Guard the resources it needs to capitalize first the first response cutter, the national security cutter programs. After cuts were mandated by sequestration, I'm disappointed that DHS has diverted these funds, and what is the impact of the diversion of these funds going to mean?
Sir, from my perspective, on the maintenance organization, none of that funding is coming out of my organization in maintenance. I'd have to refer to DHS for questions about this.
So you're not, Mr. Anderson, do you have any response to that?
No, I don't. I would also have to say that's a better question for either a DHS witness or a Coast Guard.
I mean, I don't know why we're giving money and then it's being taken from one purpose and used for another outside of the, the Coast Guard has come and said that they really need these resources, and now they've been diverted to ICE for detention beds, and I'm just telling you, I'm very disappointed. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Lowenthal. My understanding is that there are no further questions by any other, or by members of the subcommittee, so I'd like to thank our first witnesses for your testimony. Your contribution to today's discussion has been very informative and helpful. And since there are no further questions, I'll now call up panel 2. I'd like to welcome, as they're coming forward, our next panel of witnesses. Rear Admiral Ann C. Phillips, Special Assistant to the Governor for Coastal Adaptation and Protection, Office of the Governor for the Commonwealth of Virginia. Dr. Daniel Cox, CH2M Hill Professor in Civil Engineering at Oregon State University, and Mr. Sean Hecht, Co-Executive Director for the Emmett Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at the University of California at Los Angeles School of Law. Thank you for being here today, and I look forward to your testimony. Without objection, our witnesses' full statements will be included in the record. I also ask unanimous consent to include in the record a letter from the Commonwealth of Virginia's Secretary of Natural Resources that Admiral Phillips references in her testimony. Without objection, so ordered. As with the previous panel, since your written testimony has been made a part of the record, the subcommittee requests that you limit your oral testimony to 5 minutes. Admiral Phillips, you may proceed.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Acting Chairman Brown and Ranking Member Gibbs and members of the subcommittee. It's an honor to have an opportunity to testify before you all today on this very important topic. I'm Ann Phillips. I am the Special Assistant to the Governor of Virginia for Coastal Adaptation and Protection. I'm a retired surface warfare officer who drove and commanded ships for the Navy for 31 years. I've served abroad in Guam and Lisbon and operated extensively with NATO in Partnership for Peace Nations. I retired in 2014 as a Rear Admiral and Commander of Expeditionary Strike Group 2, and since then have been involved in multiple efforts to highlight the impacts of climate change as a national security issue. Now I work for the state of Virginia, where climate change has a significant impact on our coastal communities and federal infrastructure today. There is an urgent need for coordinated federal efforts to deal with the impacts. This subcommittee can help by recognizing climate resilience and disaster preparedness as one of the country's greatest and most immediate needs, and taking action to address that need now. In Virginia, we have experienced over 18 inches of relative sea level rise in 100 years. We expect to see another 18 inches by mid-century. The duration, severity, and impacts of flooding have all increased substantially, and coastal storms are magnified as a result. We are not simply preparing, we are already living with water. We have a water-based economy, all at risk. Our keystone is our federal presence, arguably the largest concentration in the nation, including our largest naval base, Naval Station Norfolk, as well as the only shipyard where we build aircraft carriers and one of only 2 places where we build nuclear-powered submarines. We also host the Coast Guard's Atlantic Area Command, 5th District, and Force Readiness Command. We are home to the Port of Virginia, 6th largest container port by traffic volume in the country. We have a tremendous beach and water-related tourism industry, along with aquaculture and fisheries industries. And finally, our waterfront property and housing stock are a key source of property tax income for our localities. To coordinate across federal, state, and local partners, Virginia has focused on collaborative opportunities, including the Hampton Roads Intergovernmental Pilot Project, or IPP, joint land use studies conducted through the Department of Defense, Office of Economic Adjustment, and Army Corps of Engineers feasibility studies under the 3x3x3 process authorized in the 2014 Water Resources Development Act. The integrated pilot project I speak of, which was conducted from 2014 to 2016, was initiated through the National Security Council and convened by Old Dominion University. It brought together over 200 federal, state, and regional professionals to develop a whole-of-government and community set of solutions and processes to prepare for sea level rise and recurrent flooding in the Hampton Roads region. This work is the subject of a recently completed dissertation by Dr. Hannah Teacher, who studied local and federal alliances in both Hampton Roads and San Diego, California. Dr. Teacher found that the shared risks between installations and the communities that surround them bring great potential for joint adaptation planning and, in fact, drive a need for it. She also determined two key enabling mechanisms as critical to initiating and reinforcing alliances between federal, state, and local partners: recognizing independence and constructing credibility. As a direct outcome of this regional collaboration conducted by the IPP, Intergovernmental Pilot Project, Hampton Roads embarked on a series of joint land use studies funded by the Office of Economic Adjustment. These included the cities of Newport News and Hampton, Norfolk and Virginia Beach, and a third study just underway in Chesapeake and Portsmouth. These studies help us understand compatible use of infrastructure by federal and particular DOD and local partners, and how climate and recurring flooding impacts and outcomes affect their environmental resilience. Virginia localities in the Commonwealth have also partnered with the Army Corps on 2 coastal storm risk management studies to further define the needs of communities dealing with rising waters and storm surge. Our local governments are in the need, and Virginia has laid groundwork to prepare elsewhere. We struggle with our General Assembly, who has been reluctant to take funded action on climate change and sea level rise. Under Governor Northam, however, we are taking bold and substantive action to address this threat. Governor Northam signed Executive Order 24, increasing Virginia's resilience to sea level rise and natural hazards in November of 2018. This directs the Commonwealth to determine the vulnerability of and set standards for state-owned infrastructure, develop a coastal protection master plan for the state of Virginia, and to coordinate, collaborate, and communicate across and with federal and local governments to ensure aligned objectives. Even with strong state action, we cannot do this alone. The actions of the subcommittee are vitally important to protecting people and property. And again, I ask that you recognize climate resilience and disaster preparedness as one of the country's greatest and most immediate needs to protect American infrastructure and our economy. We also ask that the subcommittee help states organize and prioritize and control flood control projects, including those underway with the Army Corps of Engineers, deliver timely Army Corps and Office of Economic Adjustment studies, and consider third-party analysis and study, and also include strong environmental review. In Virginia, we're committed to building capacity for our coastal communities and to collaborating with our federal and local partners. And we know we have no time to waste. Time and tide wait for no man. Thank you, yes, sir. Thank you again for the opportunity to offer this testimony. I look forward to your questions.
Sorry about that. I won't go through the entire list again if that's okay. But I would like to add one more point. I'd also like to talk a little bit about the importance of the graduate education and maintaining a strong workforce for the Coast Guard. But first, I'll talk a little bit about the risk-informed decision support tools. We've already talked today about the importance of the mission to be able to absorb and recover quickly after these extreme events. The modern risk-informed decision support tools that have been developed can be used to, in advance, predict what the consequences of these extreme events would be, and allows people to focus on optimized solutions. So trying to buy down the risk where it's the highest. It captures the uncertainties with the hazard, as well as the response of how, what's going to happen to the infrastructure once these storms come to shore. So I'll give you a couple of examples. NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, has funded a risk-based center that's producing these open source modeling tools that help with this mitigation strategy. DHS, for example, has funded a coastal resilience center that's also creating better tools for hazard prediction and looking at the related damage. Tools such as HAZUS MH can be used to look at this type of risk. Also, American Society of Civil Engineers are updating their standards for critical facilities to withstand floods, hurricane surge, and waves. These can all be used in some capacity to help make port facilities more resilient. We've already heard testimony today about the U.S. Naval Station in Virginia that's been using these risk-based tools. I think the Coast Guard would also benefit from this type of study, trying to look at where the risk is the highest for their assets. In concert with developing these strategies for the extreme events, the Coast Guard also has to consider the chronic conditions related to sea level rise and how are you going to adapt to these changing conditions in sea level and storminess. For example, the U.S. ports, Navy ports on the Pacific coast have already looked at things that would affect operational days per year of some of their infrastructure and how far into the future do they have to plan in order to keep from exceeding these thresholds. So is it a 10-year problem, 20-year problem, or a 50-year problem that helps them make better decisions on how to rehabilitate their infrastructure. Another big issue with ports is a hostile environment for infrastructure. Corrosion is a big issue, and one of the big problems facing existing ports is maintenance, rehabilitation, and repair. And I think the use of some new technologies, higher strength concrete, composites, these can help be used to extend the service life of a lot of our infrastructure. There's also an issue with permitting, so you might have a great idea, but if you want to get it permitted, you have to think about these things, and natural and nature-based features are other ways in which we can think about how to adapt, make ports adaptive to future climate change. Finally, the Coast Guard and other areas of federal government need a workforce that's trained in understanding these issues of port adaptation and resilience. Some of these training programs are already in place. Oregon State University, Texas A&M University, University of Rhode Island trains at the graduate level U.S. Coast Guard officers to be able to implement some of these solutions. These programs exist. Hope they stay in place, and even if they can be enhanced, I think that would be great for the U.S. Coast Guard. So in closing, just like to thank the subcommittee for all of the efforts and would be pleased to answer any questions.
Thank you, Chairman Brown, Ranking Member Gibbs, and members of the subcommittee. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today, and I'm pleased to discuss some of the challenges facing the Coast Guard, our ports, and other public agencies as they try to make sure our coastal infrastructure is resilient to emerging risks relating to coastal change. For over 10 years, I have studied the way that coastal managers and the insurance industry address climate change-related risks. Managers of coastal properties and infrastructure have to make strategic choices about where and how to invest. Federal management and investment decisions influence downstream infrastructure investments in the public and private sector. With that in mind, the challenges that are faced by global risk managers like insurers hold lessons for the federal government. We've built our infrastructure around a historical range of conditions, knowing there may be extreme conditions at times, but it's clear that the past is no longer a reliable indicator of the future, and the conditions that we view as extreme today will become more ordinary. Moreover, we don't know the magnitude or pace of the change precisely, since that depends on complex physical systems and on how much we reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Federal agencies have a responsibility to ensure resilience to coastal change in the management of federal assets, and vulnerability assessment and adaptation planning are essential for agencies to understand and evaluate the risks under a range of future scenarios and to strategically invest in resilience. I want to note that coastal adaptation planning is increasingly common at the state and local level. So, for example, California's Coastal Commission, which administers the Coastal Zone Management Act in California, has been very forward-thinking. And the Port of Los Angeles in Representative Lowenthal's district recently developed a sea level rise adaptation plan that evaluates physical assets exposure, sensitivity to change, and adaptive capacity. Their plan reviewed multiple scenarios to account for uncertainty from about 2 feet of sea level rise all the way up to 6 feet of sea level rise, which is within the range of predictions that we have. The private sector is focusing on adaptation more and more, and I want to focus on that for a while. Corporations are taking steps to assess and address vulnerabilities in their assets, and significantly, the insurance sector, which holds the most financial risk across the world economy, is increasingly concerned with climate-related risks. The type and level of disruption and uncertainty climate change will cause makes it challenging to plan for the future and increases the likelihood of chaotic outcomes. Climate change increases the uncertainty of risks, and this is a challenge for insurers. Insurers can't insure where they can't predict risks over time. So the major insurers are investing heavily in better understanding climate risk as they sound the alarm. For example, officials at Lloyd's of London and Munich Re noted after Hurricane Sandy the likely connections between climate change and future increases in storm damage, and we see a lot of investment by especially the largest global insurers in understanding climate better. The most recent annual survey of emerging risks by the professionals whose job it is to evaluate financial risks for the private sector, actuaries, named climate change as both the top emerging risk and the top current risk last year. The most sobering assessments within the insurance sector focus on the uncertainty that climate change injects into insurers' business models and the strategic challenges that uncertainty creates for risk management. Within U.S. insurance markets, flood insurance has long been a special case among weather-related risks, even independent of and long before we recognized climate change risk. Private insurers largely pulled out of the flood insurance market in the middle 20th century as a result of massive correlated losses from hurricanes that made many insurers view flood risk as uninsurable. One might suspect that availability of private coastal flood insurance will only get worse under emerging conditions, but recent research instead provides reason for optimism. Private flood insurance availability is improving as insurers develop more and better information about coastal risks through research, modeling, and data analysis, and as planners work to address those risks. Insurers have made clear that more robust information and analysis about emerging risk and evidence of community-scale risk mitigation planning are crucial to their ability to manage risks. The value of anticipating the need for elevation of structures or maintaining a wetland that protects structures from king tides or storm surges can be quantified and considered, and this is of value to insurers. So what does this mean for the Coast Guard and for port infrastructure? Federal planners can draw lessons. First, more information and analysis to clarify risks is crucial. Risk is inevitable, but understanding risks enables us to plan for them. Second, planning for resilience will reduce uncertainty and facilitate better investment and prioritization by federal agencies. Just as insurance underwriters are willing to address even very difficult risks where loss prevention measures are in place, federal agencies can decrease their vulnerability through sound planning. And the most crucial action is to integrate resilience planning and governance into federal actions at every step, to consider that climate change's impacts are considered in planning and decision-making about how and where we build and rebuild. Planning informs asset investment by agencies like the Coast Guard, and also can inform grant-making under, for example, the Port Infrastructure Development Grant and Port Security Grant programs. Investing early to reduce and protect assets in light of real science will pay off. Thank you for your consideration, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Hecht. We will now move on to member questions. Each member will be recognized for 5 minutes, and I'll start by recognizing myself. Admiral Phillips, you mentioned the intergovernmental pilot project, I think down at Hampton Roads. What were some of the resources that were crucial to that project that any coastal city with federal facilities would need to conduct their own integrated adaptation plan?
Yes, sir, and thank you for your question. The Intergovernmental Pilot Project was one of 4 federal and 3 Department of Defense pilot projects. It did not come with federal resources or really any resources. It was a totally voluntary effort. It was approved through Office of Secretary of Defense, and Navy was designated as lead service. So it was totally voluntary throughout. What it did have, though, that facilitated action was Old Dominion University serving as a convener to provide a neutral entity upon which to base actions and activities. It had at its start a completed charter and suggestions for working groups. There were 6 working groups and 4 advisory committees that were already formed, plus a steering committee and recommendations for who should serve on those committees and working groups and how the process should move forward. So it started with a charter in place. It was authorized by the Department of Defense, and a lead service was designated who was authorized to participate. And I would also add that we had considerable participation from the Coast Guard, Department of Homeland Security, Department of Energy, Department of Transportation, all facilitated through a letter Senator Kaine wrote requesting that the National Security Council include all of the agencies in this pilot project effort, specifically in the state of Virginia. So with that kind of written support, we had a foundation upon which to move forward. Then it was a matter of getting the cities and localities involved and engaged, and what kept them there was federal, state, and local participation, which many of them said they had not seen before. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Cox, in your testimony, you discussed the potential applications of risk-informed decision support tools. And what do you see are potential barriers to utilizing a tool like that?
I think for the ports in particular, a lot of these. I think so. But I think of the Coast Guard in particular, the barriers, I think one is having the training, people that can operate these tools. That's, it's not just off the shelf. You need somebody who really knows what they're doing, can interpret the results. I think a second thing is a lot of the consequence, like how much damage could occur. It could be specific to the type of asset that the Coast Guard has, and if those relations aren't developed yet, then somebody has to, either through expert opinion or computer modeling or experiments, come up with what those damage functions would be. So depending on what they're trying to look at, if it's a building, that's kind of, you could say that's done already, but if it's a particular port asset, there might have to be some work behind the scenes to get the right damage function.
Thank you. I'll now recognize. Oh, we'll go down that way. Okay. I'll now recognize, with one exception, each member for, no, I will now recognize each member for an additional 5 minutes of questions, and we'll begin with Ms. Miller.
Thank you, Chairman Brown and Ranking Member Gibbs. I appreciate that. And thank you all for being here today. Rear Admiral Phillips, how can Congress better collaborate with our state and local leaders when it comes to disaster preparedness?
Thank you for your question, ma'am. The challenge for state and local leaders is that there are a number of federal programs that work disaster preparedness, pre-disaster, FEMA, HUD, NOAA, NIFWIF, just to name a few. They are not coordinated amongst themselves, and this is a part of our challenge. There are also programs being developed within the Department of Defense, the Defense Community Infrastructure Program, which was created under the 2019 National Defense Authorization Act, but not funded, not appropriated, and also Defense Access Roads Program, which comes out of MILCON dollars, which are always scarce across the services, are also options and opportunities for localities and the state perhaps to collaborate with federal entities. But the real challenge is, and the real need is for a coordinated effort across federal agencies that focuses on this issue, that aligns grants and funding, and that is understandable and accessible by not only states, but also localities.
Thank you. I have found that same issue in West Virginia in dealing with things. Dr. Cox, what are the key factors that lead to Coast Guard infrastructure resiliency so that the service can quickly recover from extreme weather events and transition to emergency response and search rescue operations?
Could you please repeat just the first part of the question?
What are the key factors that lead to Coast Guard infrastructure resiliency?
Yeah, I think one of the keys is implementing the findings of these studies. So if they're looking at here's where the greatest risk is, they know what the greatest risk is, okay, well, there needs to be a way to implement those findings.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Hecht, what can commercial and residential areas do to protect themselves and mitigate damage from flooding, such as the devastation that struck West Virginia earlier this year?
Thank you for the question. The best thing that local governments can do and communities is to do the proper kind of planning. And often what we see is that scenario planning, looking at various different possible futures because of the uncertainty, is essential to being able to plan properly. So we might look at one scenario which has a relatively small amount of coastal change and another area with a different set of assumptions. And vulnerability assessment is the practice of doing that and also looking at the social vulnerability, not just the physical vulnerability, but the social and economic vulnerability that go along with that. So we see many examples of local governments that are doing that kind of adaptation planning. One of the biggest challenges that they face in that planning is funding to do the planning, and then of course the implementation, which sometimes creates not only funding challenges, but also challenges of political will, because governments have to make hard choices sometimes that affect residents in challenging ways.
Thank you very much. I yield back my time. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Lowenthal.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My first question is for Mr. Cox. In your testimony, you discussed, and this is both the written especially, you discussed how natural and nature-based features can be used to protect port infrastructure. Can you elaborate on how expanded uses of natural and nature-based features are beneficial to private industry, and how can they be used on the large scale, such as port in, it's some of our busiest nation's ports, which I represent?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So the role of natural nature-based features, one thing is it can be used to mitigate the intensity of the storm. So it can reduce surge, wave action, the stuff that's going to impact the structure. The other thing it can help to do is to change patterns of sedimentation. So one of the big issues with ports is keeping them open for shipping. And so if you're using a natural system to trap the sediments, basically you can improve the navigability of the ports.
What kinds of natural
In Florida, for example, mangroves. So after Hurricane Irma, Maria, they saw that areas with mangroves suffered a lot less damage. With climate change, there's a potential there's going to be more mangroves along the Texas coast and further north. So that's just one example. One of the other ones is called biocementation. So this is a process where you're accelerating the rate at which sediments can adhere to each other. Basically,
yes,
could eventually turn it into sandstone if you wanted to. But trying to come up with an engineering way to apply that after a big storm that instead of using sandbags or geotubes or something like that.
Thank you. Mr. Hecht, in your testimony, you talked about my part of the country when you were talking about the Port of Los Angeles, which is just adjacent to my district. I'm the Port of Long Beach. But they're really one combined port. In its sea level rise adaptation plan, might be an example for the rest of the country. Can you elaborate on how the port actually designed and implemented this plan, and what can we learn from adaptation projects on this magnitude?
Yes, thank you for the question, Representative Lowenthal, and I apologize for mischaracterizing the boundaries of your district.
I will take the port of, I represented the Port of LA and Long Beach as Mr. Mark. Well, while I was in the state legislature, so I accept some ownership.
So the port's planning process was detailed in a paper that they published recently, just in the last few months. I haven't dug into the details of the adaptation plan, and my understanding is that it came out recently enough that there hasn't yet been implementation. But what seems innovative about it to me and important is the fact that they're doing scenario planning, that they are looking at different possible futures, some futures with less sea level rise, some with more, some with a certain amount of storm surge, and doing that and basing their determinations on that modeling. The other really important feature of any sound adaptation planning, which appears to be in the port's plan, is that they're integrating plans for resilience in their planning process. It's not just a matter of let's build this thing here and let's remove that thing there. It's a matter of integrating this type of planning whenever they're making decisions about their infrastructure so that they understand what the vulnerabilities are of that infrastructure under different scenarios. And so they explicitly have put into their planning and governance taking into account the latest projections of sea level rise and related risks over time as they plan new infrastructure, as they think about what they're doing going forward. So those seem to me to be the most important features, and they're the features of any really worthwhile adaptation planning process.
I also kind of looking at and want Mr. Hecht maybe a greater understanding of how potentially some of our interventions, the very intervention may cause some problems. I raise that in terms of, as we invest in resilient shore infrastructure, I think it's important to keep in mind the environmental impacts of these very upgrades and what they might have. Not only should we be concerned about adapting to the impact of climate change, but we have to look at how we can mitigate the environmental impact of the new infrastructure itself. And so can you talk about how investing in resilient shoreside infrastructure can be an important way of reducing our overall environmental footprint?
I'd be happy to. Mr. Chairman, I see my time,
Oh.
time is out, but may I?
Well, since we're on short final, why don't you go ahead and answer the question?
Thank you.
Please.
So that's a really important point. And so the California Coastal Commission is a good example of an agency that is really taking those considerations into account. So in their planning processes, they are looking very closely at shoreline armoring like seawalls and the spillover impacts that those might have, and encouraging the use of other types of solutions, some of which include the types of natural infrastructure solutions that Dr. Cox was talking about. In some cases, it's going to be difficult or impossible to do that, to protect particular kinds of assets that are fixed in place with very long useful lives. But where possible, that's a key aspect of planning, is to try to take that into account. And it's not just about destroying nature and ecosystems, it's also about spillover impacts on other users of the coastline and beach loss and other impacts like that. That question really does get at the heart of an important point. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for that very important question and rounding out your 5 minutes brilliantly. Yes. Mr. Gibbs.
Thank you, Chairman. The GAO's 10 recommendations for the Coast Guard managing the shoreside infrastructure, which do you see, or if any, of those recommendations apply to local ports and the maritime transportation system? Whoever wants to answer it.
So I am not deeply familiar with all the recommendations in the GAO report. I looked at the report, but I don't have it in front of me now. I don't know if my co-panelists can, but I'm happy to talk about particular ideas.
Well, that's fine. I'll go on. I'll move on. But I guess, Mr. Heck, I guess you got my attention when you talked about out in California, the California Coastal Commission figures either the variation of a 2-foot to a 6-foot rise in sea level, which is, I think, a pretty good variation. I guess my first thought is, what is the sea level rise at the Port of LA, for example? I was out there a few years ago. I know it's all built in dredge material. I was fascinated by that port out there. But what have we seen, if any, rise in the last 20, 30 years, or what's going on? Just give me an idea what I get.
So over the last century, we've seen an average over the country of 6 to 8 inches. I think that the rise is slightly less in Southern California so far. There is evidence from research that the rate of rise is accelerating, and you're correct that that is a highly variable range. That's based on estimates not just from the Coastal Commission, but also from NOAA, which is really NOAA has done incredible work to really try to define the parameters of sea level rise, and its most recent report, I believe it's the most recent report from 2018, provides a lot of insight into it. It is hugely challenging to have that type of a range, and again, that's
Well, that goes where you mentioned a little about the insurance to the actuaries, but how do you, we're building resilient infrastructure. How do you figure that, you start looking at cost-benefit analysis and, try to be reasonable, practical?
Right. So you look at robustness over a range of scenarios, and you can't look at just one scenario, you look at the range of scenarios, and you can't always plan for the worst case, but you can plan for infrastructure to be resilient over a range of the most probable outcomes, and you can have different plans for different scenarios that are adaptable in 10 or 20 or 30 years. When we see different levels of change, you create infrastructure that's adaptable enough that we can build that resilience in and change it if we need to. So creating something that might more easily be elevated, for example, if you're building something new rather than something that's so fixed in place that it's immovable, would be an example of that.
Yeah, if you're starting new construction, it'd be more cost-effective, probably.
Yes.
Okay. I don't know if this is a pertinent question to this panel. I think maybe we'll see. The Great Lakes. I don't know you're from Oregon, and you're from California, and you're from Virginia, so, you know,
I went to law school at University of Michigan, so
okay, well, okay.
lived in Michigan for a while.
We're looking at, you know, resilience planning in the Great Lakes is, you know, should the Great Lakes be just as concerned as our coastal? Because we don't have hurricanes, we don't have, we kind of do have, sometimes have nor'easters, but we don't have tropical storms. You know, what's the risk on the Great Lakes? 'Cause
I think the planning tools are there, and if they're used, they can basically.
A microphone, I think.
Sorry, so maybe I'll talk a little bit closer. I think the Great Lakes benefit as well from the resilience planning. So it's really just about the ability to absorb and recover quickly. And it's up to the Great Lakes to say, this is how quickly we would need to recover, or this is how much we can absorb. But I think the tools are there and useful for the Great Lakes as well.
Of course, with the freezing and thawing, the ice, there might be a different, you know, consideration that you don't have in LA, obviously. Because if you have that problem in LA, then we got a different issue, right?
Yeah, we're not headed that way.
Yeah, yeah. All right, I yield back, I think, thanks.
Are there any further questions from members of the subcommittee? Seeing none, I'd like to thank each of the witnesses for your testimony today. Your contribution to today's discussion has been very informative and helpful. I ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may be submitted to them in writing, and unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for any additional comments and information submitted by members or witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. If no other members have anything to add, this subcommittee stands adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.